We
are
We
cultivate.
Cultivate.
We are cultivate.
Hello and welcome to Ye Olde Crime, where we discuss the funny, strange, and obscure crimes of yesteryear. I'm your host, Lindsay Valenti, and with me today is not only my sister and co-host, Maddie Stengel,
Hi.
but also special guest, DeLani Bartlette, who you may know from her YouTube channel, The Murder Nerd, but I will let her tell us a little more about that herself. Welcome, DeLani.
Hi,
Welcome.
thanks so much for having me. Yeah, my YouTube channel is just called The Murder Nerd. I cover cases. Sometimes I talk about recent cases, but I also kind of go into historical cases like you guys do.
Mhm.
And I just find it really fascinating. And I was really excited to come on your show.
We're excited to have you.
Yeah, thank you for reaching out and offering to be on the show. We got connected through Podmatch, which is a really cool network of podcasts and podcast guests to kind of like match people together. So, really excited to have you on the show.
Thanks.
And you are going to be regaling us with the mysterious death of one Edgar Allan Poe.
Yes. Love Edgar Allan Poe. I've been a fan of his writing since I was a young middle schooler, which was way back before rocks got hard.
Nice.
But I didn't know this until, after I was in college, that his death was this whole mysterious thing that had never, to this day, been really solved as to what actually happened to him. And I find that just so delicious that he invented the detective story genre and his death was such a mystery. I'm like,
Yeah.
oh, gold.
Right. Like, did he do that on purpose?
Yeah.
In the end?
Right.
Was that all his doing?
That would be nice, but I honestly don't think so.
Yeah, probably not.
Sadly, if it was one of those things where he'd staged this fabulous disappearance, a la, was it Agatha Christie,
Yeah.
who just like disappeared for a
Yeah.
while?
Mhm.
That would be super cool. But no, his was a little more sad.
But that's kind of on par for him too.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Sad.
very sad.
Yeah.
A little melancholy.
Very
Yep,
on brand.
very much so.
Yes.
But yeah, we're coming up on the anniversary of his death. Basically, I went at it as Auguste Dupin would do, as I retraced his last steps.
Nice.
And so, it kind of starts, at least where I think it kind of starts, is on September 26th, 1849. So he was in the midst of a lecture tour. He was going through Philadelphia, Richmond, Virginia, and Norfolk, and he was like trying to raise money. He was going to launch a new literary magazine called The Stylus. And so he was doing these lecture tours, trying to raise money. Anyway, he was back in Richmond, Virginia on September 26th as kind of a stopover. He had a friend who he had promised that he would meet with her and help her edit some of her poems.
Could you imagine doing that while you're traveling?
That's a lot.
That's a good friend. That's a good friend. Like, yeah, I'll stop my tour to
Yeah.
edit for you. That's
Right. Well, and here's the thing, if I remember correctly, so if there's any history buffs out there, feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that she was kind of a big, like, patron
Oh,
of his,
sure.
so, when
there was
she
more
asks
incentive.
Yes.
yeah,
Yes.
but yeah, so fact check me on that, but if I recall correctly, that was the deal.
Okay.
So he's in Richmond, Virginia on September 26th, 1849. He had a visit with his then fiancee, Elmira Royster Shelton,
What a
and
name.
she said that he seemed like he was ill, that he wasn't feeling well, and she had urged him to call off the rest of the trip. And she had heard that there'd been a cholera outbreak in
Oh.
Philadelphia whenever Poe
Ooh.
had been there, and she thought, "Oh, he might be showing symptoms." But, he was like, "Nah, I'll be
Did the
fine."
total man
Whatever.
thing where it's like, no, I'm good.
Yeah,
I'm not
right.
sick. My arm's
I don't
falling
know.
off, but I'm fine.
I don't know, the men I know are total babies. Like,
Right.
"Oh, I have a sniffle. Oh, can you make me soup?" Yeah,
Yeah.
but yeah, no, he kinda brushed it off, and the next leg of the trip was gonna be he was gonna catch a boat and go to Baltimore,
Okay.
and that, I guess, was where he
Okay.
was gonna meet his friends. Sorry if I was unclear on
Sure.
that. Anyway, so 9:30 that evening, September 26th, he met with an old friend named Dr. John Carter in his Dr. John Carter's
Hmm.
office. And they chatted for a while, but then Poe took his leave rather suddenly. He said he was going to a restaurant called Sadler's. And in
Mm.
fact, he kind of left so like hastily that he took the doctor's cane, which had a hidden sword in it, and
Awesome.
left his own.
That's
Yeah, I know, right?
sweet.
Interesting.
Yeah, right. And it's even more like when you hear the rest of the story, it becomes even more like crazy. But anyway, so Dr. Carter waited for Edgar to return with his cane, but he never did. Later on, Carter spoke with the guy Sadler who owned the
Hmm.
restaurant. And
Mhm.
Sadler said that, yeah, Poe had been there and he'd met with some friends and he'd stayed up talking and visiting until about midnight. Sadler said that when Poe left, he seemed sober and in good spirits.
Okay.
So, okay.
Okay. So not feeling sick.
Right. Yeah.
Interesting. Okay.
So his boat going to Baltimore for the next leg of this tour left at 4 a.m. the next
That
morning.
is so early.
I know. Oh my God.
That's
That hurts
disgusting.
me just thinking about it.
Oh
But
God.
apparently he left in so much haste that he left his luggage in his room at the Swan Tavern.
That sounds like something I would do. Like,
No, this sounds like a murder mystery he's trying to weave.
yeah.
Like,
I know,
truly.
right?
Like, you forgot, quote, unquote.
Mhm.
Yeah, so weird. After that point, after, when Sadler saw him at his restaurant on midnight, like that's the last that we hear about him. But he was apparently on the boat because the boat arrived in Baltimore on September 28th. There's some evidence that Poe had tried to call on an acquaintance of his that lived there, but he was out of town. But that's really, we don't have anything else telling us where he might have been or what he was doing from September 28th until October 3rd.
Oh wow, that's
Wow.
a big span of time.
Yeah,
How awful would you feel being that friend that missed the call?
I know,
Like, at
right?
the end?
Well, and
Yeah. But
he's
also,
got no clothes or anything. So he's supposedly
right,
like or potentially in the same outfit for like over a week.
Well, and if
right?
he was
Very
raising
odd.
money, did he leave the money
Yeah.
in his luggage? You would assume he wouldn't have it on his person, right? Or maybe he would.
I
No.
I honestly don't know about that, but that is a really good question. I don't think he left the money, and it might not have been that they were, like, giving him money. It might have been more like
Oh,
they would
maybe,
pledge to support,
Sure.
maybe? But I don't know.
or maybe they would send it in somewhere. They would mail
Right.
Yeah. Almost like
Yeah.
to a
I mean,
certain
I don't
place.
know.
yeah, almost like a like wire the money or something. I'm trying to think of what they had
Yeah,
available at that point in time in history. Like if it was something where they would send, like a Western Union type of thing, like we are going to be
right.
pledging
Yeah.
you X amount of money, or if it was,
Right.
So
like the
crazy.
weird checks they had.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I would
Yeah.
suppose if people had just like cash or checks that they would want to give him,
Hmm.
he
Mhm.
would have to have some of that.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. That's really not clear as far as that
Hmm.
goes. Like it may be that he didn't have any money with him because he had dropped it off when he was in Norfolk
Yeah.
visiting
Mm-hmm.
with his fiance and everything.
Yeah.
Because there's
Yeah,
no mention,
potentially.
I didn't find anyway any mention about any money. So that's that's just my supposition on that. So
That would make
Yeah.
sense to give it to her because, yeah, you wouldn't want to be carrying a whole bunch of cash or checks or anything with you, especially if
No.
you're traveling like that. just seems like a recipe for disaster, especially if he's like forgetting
Right.
canes and luggage places. Like,
Yeah.
I
Well, and
know.
if he's well known too, and people think that he's this wealthy, famous,
Yeah.
artist, essentially, that he would have money with him. I think that would be a safe assumption as well.
yeah,
Exactly.
be a prime
Yeah,
target for
that's
thievery.
Mm-hmm.
So, and that brings us to October 3rd, which was an election day.
Oh,
And a man named
Interesting.
Joseph Walker, who was a typesetter for a local newspaper, found Edgar Allan Poe in a, quote, semi-conscious state in the street.
ooh,
What?
Yeah, he was delirious and dressed in ill-fitting, dirty clothes, including worn boots and a cheap palm leaf hat.
weird.
Because he was so sort of out of it, the only thing that this guy Walker could like get out of him was Dr. J.E. Snodgrass. So Walker wrote that name down and helped Poe get into like a room at a nearby pub to like wait until they could get a hold of this
Sleep it
doc.
off.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Well, that was nice of him.
yeah,
That was very
Yeah.
kind of him to help him out, because I feel like
Yeah.
normally too, where you are, there are so many people who just would walk past him,
yeah,
just no
Right.
matter who he was.
yeah. Just
Yeah. Well, and it might be that he just recognized him like from being in the publishing biz or whatever.
yeah.
Mhm.
And was
Like,
like,
oh my,
"Hey."
are you Edgar Allan Poe?
Are you
Like,
okay?
are you okay?
Yeah,
Like,
Right.
what would I do if I saw a celebrity in the streets? Like,
yeah.
do you want me to help?
Are you practicing a bit? Like,
Don't
what's
you have
going on?
don't you have people? You have people, right? No.
Yeah. So they were able to get a hold of Dr. Snodgrass, and when he arrived at the room, yeah, when he arrived at the room, he just assumed that Poe was drunk
That's a fair
because he
assumption.
was just acting, yeah, right. So they took him to this place called the Washington College Hospital, and they had a ward for recovering alcoholics, and so they took him there.
Boy, they have a whole ward,
Yeah,
a whole drunk tank ward. Interesting.
yeah. Well, the DTs are rough, man. I'm behind that.
Ugh.
So they tried to make him comfortable and, you know, hopefully he would like dry out or whatever, but he never got conscious or regained his mental state.
Oh wow.
Wow.
He couldn't answer any questions about, what's going on, how did you get this way, what happened? Like he just couldn't answer any questions. He seemed like he was having hallucinations. They said that on occasion he would shout the name Reynolds, but like nobody knows what that means or why he was yelling it, or it was just like this random mysterious thing.
Was opium still like a big thing then? Like, it seems like if he was
Yeah.
hallucinating and stuff, maybe he
Right.
didn't like technically OD or whatever, but maybe opium? I don't know.
Right, but here's the thing. He was like this. He stayed in this semi-conscious hallucinatory state for 4 days.
Yeah, that nixes my theory.
No
Yeah,
drug.
that wouldn't be a drug.
Mm-mm.
Yeah. No drug, no alcohol, nothing. So on October 7th, 1849 is when he died. It's unclear. Some say he died at 3 a.m., some at 5 a.m., but they never filed a death certificate because it wasn't like required back in those days. No autopsy was performed, and at first he was sort of hastily buried in an unmarked grave in Baltimore's Winchester Burial Grounds.
That is so insulting. Like,
I
he wasn't a
know.
pauper. That's horrible.
That's just, well, that kind of makes sense a little bit, because a lot of hospitals, like even to this day, like to keep their death counts and their death rates low. So it would make sense that they would want to kind of quietly put him somewhere, and may or may not want to say that he died there.
But people knew him.
Yeah.
Like, you would think that
Some people knew him.
You would think that someone
But-
who had seen him over the course of those 4 days would be like, yeah, this is kind of an important guy. We should probably bury him with like a marker at least. Like, like not just shove him in the ground
but
in like a pauper's type grave.
Right.
Like,
I suppose, but at the same time, do you want to be the hospital that killed Edgar Allan Poe?
I don't think the
Well, I
hospital would have
mean,
paid for it. It would have been like a friend or something, don't you think? Or maybe I'm assuming the friends were super
I
nice.
think that's what it came down to, is that he didn't have any money on him. He didn't have any friends that, were good enough friends to like pay for his burial.
Hmm.
Right.
And I mean, this is before embalming was really a thing. Like it had been
Mhm.
invented, I think, but it wasn't. So like you had to get him in the ground pretty quick.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah, that's
So
true.
I feel like it was just a matter of like he didn't have any money, he didn't have any people, and they had to, get this carcass under the ground really quick.
Yeah.
And so it was just kind of, I mean, that's my theory. I don't know.
And I suppose
Yeah,
he
that
would
makes
have
sense.
been too delirious to say anything about like contacting his fiance or anything to have her
Right.
come
Right.
out there, because you would think that would be the first person you would contact, but if no one really knew who his fiance was, I mean,
Mhm.
Right.
or where
How
she
could you
was,
even reach her?
yeah, how would you
Yeah.
even reach out to her?
Right. And it's just kind of how things were at that time. It wasn't like, people walked around carrying ID
Mhm.
or had
Right.
any, there was no way to just easily get a hold of someone. So,
Right. And who's to say too that they actually believed that was him?
Mhm.
If
right.
he's like, it's this delirious person that somebody said was Edgar Allan Poe, but he's acting so unlike who
Mhm.
he is. They could
Yeah.
be like, oh, well, this is just some random guy with no money and no contacts and no friends, and
Mhm.
Right.
we just gotta get rid of him.
He did have a doctor who was, sort of treating him while he was at the Westminster Hospital. His name was Dr. Moran. And Dr. Moran didn't offer a specific diagnosis or cause of death. The newspapers at the time reported that he died of, quote, inflammation of the brain or, quote, congestion of the brain. But again, no official diagnosis, no autopsy, nothing like this. And so, obviously, over the years, there have been many, many theories, which I don't know. Do you guys have a theory, or do you, do you want me to just jump into the theories?
I don't know. I feel like if he was delirious, I mean that could be,
Yeah.
definitely dehydration in some capacity, or if it was some sort of brain swelling, he could have had a subdermal hematoma,
Mhm.
which
Yeah.
would have caused a lot of that like cognitive impairment. And you
Hmm.
would, I mean, without really understanding what's happening, you would die slowly.
Yeah.
So
Hmm.
that kind of makes sense. So I don't know if he just fell and hit his head, or if somebody hit him, or
He could have had a
um,
stroke, like it,
yeah,
because I
Yeah.
I looked up the symptoms for cholera. That's why I was tippity-tapping.
I did
But
too.
but
I
I
was
but I
looking
was
at it
like
too.
none of these are
Yeah.
anywhere
No.
near
No.
the symptoms he would have had.
Yeah.
Mm-mm.
Cholera is like gastrointestinal, right?
Yeah, it's
Yep.
your basically stuff's coming out of both ends, and you basically die from
Until you
dehydration.
die.
Hmm.
Hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. And he didn't have anything like that.
Mm-mm.
Yeah. I don't think it was that either. So a lot of people over the years have kind of assumed that he basically drank himself to death, that he died of alcohol poisoning or maybe alcohol plus opium or, some combination thereof. And a lot of that is because of this guy. Let me look up his name really quickly. Rufus Griswold.
I love these names.
What a name.
I love these names.
Rufus Griswold was Poe's sort of colleague, but also rival. Like they were kind of both writers, and Griswold,
Frenemies.
Frenemies,
yeah,
yeah.
kind of frenemies. Yeah, yeah. So Griswold, wrote Poe's obituary for the New York Tribune.
Wow.
And it
That
literally
choice.
starts, Edgar Allan Poe is dead. He died in Baltimore the day before yesterday. This announcement will startle many, but few will be grieved by it.
Oh, that
Yeah,
So
he says
rude.
Poe.
Damn.
I know. I mean, this whole thing threw so much shade. It said that he had few or no friends. It accused him of harboring the worst passions like envy and arrogance. I mean, it did at least give him credit for being a good writer, but like it was a complete character
Damn.
assassination.
That's so awful.
And that literally, like, that piece of shade has kind of formed like the basis of what most people think about Edgar Allan Poe to this day.
That's
And it was
crazy.
literally written by someone who was like, this is like the final word. He gets the last word in, you
Ugh,
know?
Gross.
that is gross.
Yeah.
Ugh.
But like we were just saying, if it was alcohol, like alcohol wouldn't last for 4 days like
Mm-mm.
that.
No, and you would have had something. You would likely have something like cirrhosis, where he'd be vomiting
Mm-hmm.
blood and that like black grainy
Mm-hmm.
ish that you get. So that would have been something he would have pinpointed.
Mercury poisoning causes shock,
Mm.
permanent brain damage, and some affected individuals experience mental confusion. So it could be something where it was a matter of he was poisoned. I don't know why, but keep in mind, so I'm going to throw out a wild conspiracy theory. Because why not?
I'm ready.
It's not like he can like dispute it. But so if he was missing, or if people didn't know where he was for like 5 days, and when they find him, he's like wearing clothes that obviously are not his clothes, and he's delirious, who's to say that someone on that boat didn't like realize who he was? Maybe they robbed him and tried to like get rid of him, but they didn't get the dosage right. So they did enough damage where he's like, he's super confused and disoriented. And they're like, oh shit, now what? So they try to disguise who he is by like putting him in all these random clothes and just kind of dump him somewhere in the hopes that he'll pass away. No one will know who he is. Let us assume he was a drunk that just had too much to drink and he died on the street.
That's a pretty good theory. I mean,
That is a good
for
theory.
sure. For
I'm
sure.
trying to see.
Another one of the big theories that goes around is, okay, well, maybe he didn't like OD on alcohol, but maybe he had this like there's a genetic disease, and I can't think of what the name of it is, that your body can't metabolize alcohol.
Yes.
And
Mhm.
it was said that he would get like really, really sick after he would drink, even small amounts. And so they're like, maybe it was that, you know?
Mm-hmm.
But again, like his symptoms just don't line up with if because he had drunk. I'm a writer. I know words.
Words are hard, man. Words are hard.
They are.
They are, man.
But he had imbibed alcohol, and it didn't, I mean, like, he would get sick, but it wasn't no, like, 4 days of being
Yeah.
completely out of his mind. So, I kinda don't think that was it.
Where was he found too?
He was found in front of a tavern that was also a polling place. This was an election day,
Oh yeah.
Okay.
which I wanna make that the last one that we
Sure.
talk
Yeah.
about
Sure.
because it's my favorite theory.
If it was mercury poisoning, if he was found close to like an industrial area, he could have had he could have breathed in a lot of that mercury too and
Mhm.
exposed that way.
Yeah.
Potentially not just like eating a bunch of fish.
Yeah. Eating a
Right?
bunch of
It's
tainted
just
fish.
no money eating raw fish.
Right. But isn't it more of a slow acting? Because that's why they called them Mad
Yeah.
Hatters, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That they would be exposed to it and they would slowly, kind of like lead poisoning. It would
Yeah.
build up, and you would get worse and worse gradually, gradually over the years.
But
So,
if someone like tried to kill you with it and like injected you with it,
It could be acute. Yeah.
yeah.
I was gonna say about like the alcohol thing, and now I just lost my train of thought.
It could be tainted alcohol.
Oh, what if he knew he got sick? Why would he drink a lot of alcohol? Like he
Right.
wouldn't He wouldn't set out and be like, you know what sounds like a great idea today? Getting really sick by drinking a lot of alcohol.
Well, and
Exactly.
he had a responsibility. He was doing an official tour. This wasn't him just hanging
Right.
out. It was him like meeting people along the way, but he still was on
Yeah.
business essentially.
Yeah, absolutely. And during that time, it's been said that this was one of his sober, because he would struggle with alcohol.
Mm-hmm.
He had, had his struggles in the past, but he seemed as though he had kicked it and was like staying sober.
Mm-hmm.
Like even the innkeeper, the restaurant person said like,
Yeah.
yeah, they were visiting and laughing, but he wasn't drinking. He was
Yeah,
sober.
he was sober when he
Right.
left.
So, yeah.
And that would make sense too, because if he had to catch a boat at 4 a.m, you wouldn't want to get drunk at midnight and
And
try to
potentially pass out
struggle
in
to
your
sober
room
up
and miss the bus. Or
and
not the
miss
bus, the
your
boat.
boat flight.
Yeah.
The bus of the sea.
The water bus.
It ended up being a struggle bus for him either way.
Yeah,
That
that's
was
true. It's true.
Yeah.
All right, I'm ready for the conspiracies.
Yeah.
Okay, so we talked about possible alcohol poisoning, about the possible genetic disorder. Some people think he might have had a brain tumor.
Mm.
And in fact, when his body was disinterred in order to be buried in Baltimore with, a proper headstone and all that,
Mm-hmm.
the undertaker who handled his remains said he heard something hard rattle around inside the skull. And so, but they didn't x-ray or,
Yeah.
do any kind of autopsy. So, like, okay, maybe, possibly. But it's weird. Like, if he has a brain tumor, why is he wearing these odd clothes?
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and what would be rattling around?
Yeah, I was gonna say, do tumors like solidify like after you die? Like what happens to tumors after you die? I'm gonna Google it.
It depends on the type of tumor. So, I
I
mean,
don't
it
think they
could be like
calcify in the
calcified.
skull.
That's the
Yeah.
Yeah. So,
I
I
don't
mean, that
think they
is a
would calcify
possibility.
that way. Or maybe if he got like hit or something at some point, like a tooth or some sort of bone could have gone up where it shouldn't have, caused some
Yeah.
brain issues. A
Yeah.
tooth would have rattled.
Yeah. Yeah, because the brain tumor theory fits much better with his symptoms, right?
Yeah.
But the fact that he was wearing these weird clothes, and you could say, well, he forgot his luggage, so he had to just buy whatever he could get. But like, Poe was always very meticulous about his looks.
Right.
Like, even when he was really poor, he always made sure he looked very neat and nice, and
Right.
that was just his thing. And for him to wear, like, the clothes he was wearing were not anything
Mm-mm.
he would have worn, and like the cheap weird hat and like the rundown boots, like it just, like, that does not make any kind of sense, right?
Yeah, that to me means that somebody robbed him and traded clothes at some point.
Yeah.
Right. And that, I think,
A
is a good
vagabond.
segue into, let me give you a little historical lesson here. Back in the day, there was a practice called cooping, cooping, cooping. And so this was, back in the days when politics was very different.
Mm-hmm.
And literally, like, politicians and political parties would have like gangs. Like,
Yes, I have heard of this. Yes.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
okay. Yeah. So what they would do is they would kidnap people on election day and either get them super, super drunk or beat them into submission, and then like force them to vote for whatever candidate, and like
Mm-hmm.
make them change clothes, take them to a different place, have them vote again, rinse, repeat.
Interesting.
Sure. Yeah.
And so this is why I feel like this theory fits the most. Okay.
Sure.
Number one, he was wearing weird ass clothes that were not his
Mhm.
clothes.
Yep.
Why else would he be wearing these clothes? Number two, it was election day, and he was found right in front of a pub that was a polling station.
Yep.
Right. Like, here's your last stop.
Yeah, he kept saying this name, Reynolds. And so it makes me wonder if they had, like, told him, if they ask your name is Reynolds. And so he was just sort of like his brain.
Gotcha.
And so if they had beaten him, if they had struck him in the head
Mhm.
and given him, like you mentioned earlier, a subdural hematoma,
Hmm.
that would absolutely fit with the symptoms. And because he had such thick hair, I mean, they didn't shave his head or
They wouldn't have even thought to look on his head if they thought he was drunk.
No.
right, if it wasn't bleeding or whatever, like
Mhm.
they didn't. And then that also explains the rattling in his skull, that if he had a skull fracture that caused a
Sure.
subdural hematoma,
Sure.
and then
Mhm.
through the process of decomposition, those little pieces of bone, fell away into the
Sure.
cranial
Right.
vault. That's what I think happened.
The swelling would have gone down too
Hmm.
after death.
Mhm.
Hmm.
And you wouldn't have known too with a lot of subdermal hematomas, your skull doesn't expand as your
Right.
brain swells. So
Right.
there would have been no outside symptoms, which
Right.
is why it's so deadly.
Hmm.
Yeah, exactly. And they did the exact wrong thing. They just tried to make him
Right.
comfortable and let him sleep. They
Yep.
didn't even think to
Yeah.
look for any kind of brain
Really
trauma.
can't let him sleep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Not a good idea.
And so that's what I think fits with everything. And this is why it goes back when I said that him having that cane that had a sword in it is such interesting. Like he potentially could have defended himself quite
Sure.
well,
Mhm.
Sure.
but he probably had no idea that that cane had a sword in it.
Why would
So
he?
Right.
Why would he?
Well, and at the same time, too, who's to say that he wasn't jumped by like
Hmm.
several men if it was kind of gang activity in that way, and they just saw an outsider who could vote for the people, like they
Hmm.
caught him as soon as he got off the boat,
Hmm.
yep.
welcomed him, tricked him into like a meal or something,
If
pretended
even
to
that,
buddy
they
buddy.
could have just jumped him.
Well, yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
Or
Exactly.
pretended to be somebody that like, oh, you're here for a talk? Like let's lead you over here and then just hit him on the
Mhm.
back of the head while
Right.
he's not paying attention.
It would make sense then too why nobody else had heard from him if somebody intercepted him right
Yep.
away as soon as he got off the
Well,
boat.
and they wouldn't have necessarily had to have gotten him right off the boat. Just because there's no records of anything doesn't necessarily mean he was missing.
Hmm.
I mean, he might have just
Right.
been, maybe took a day to rest in his room and then just, went out and got something to eat. And I mean, there were no records. People didn't
Well,
leave records the way we leave them now, where every single thing we
right.
do, there's a digital, our cell phones ping and we
Hmm.
use our debit card and, blah, blah, blah. He could have just been, kind of laying low or whatever. And then on election day, he was out and got jumped and this happened.
I suppose, yeah, because you wouldn't have to necessarily, write in, check in with your identification at that time.
Because you wouldn't
Right.
necessarily have had any. People
Mhm.
didn't carry around IDs really. Like it wasn't something that you just had on your person.
And if he's trying to raise money, it's not like he would go to a highfalutin, like high end hotel where people would want to make known that he was there
Hmm.
or something was happening too.
Hmm.
Hmm.
Maybe he wanted to lay low, and so he would go to inns or different.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or And maybe he was thinking he could just stay with his one friend,
Hmm.
and then when his friend
Mhm.
wasn't home, he's like, "Oh, well, I just gotta find a place cheap because, maybe I don't have a lot of
Mhm.
money on me."
Yep.
And so he just found,
Right.
some pub with rooms or you know what I
Yeah.
mean? Like, just
Yeah.
whatever he could find.
Right.
Yeah.
But we'll never know.
Well, and
Dang.
like if it was a super busy polling day, depending on how many people were out and about in town, it would have been very easy for him to kind of get lost and, you know, if
Mhm.
unless people knew who he was or recognized him, he could have just been, staying
Mhm.
wherever.
Right. Because I mean, he wasn't that recognizable. Like he wasn't that much of a personality where people would be like, "Oh my
It's
god,
Poe.
Yeah.
it's Edgar Allan Poe."
Yeah. Kinda like a famous author nowadays, like, people who read
Right.
would be like, "Oh, yeah, that's so and so,"
Hmm.
but people who
Mhm.
don't, "Who's that?
Yeah,
Who cares?"
exactly.
Right?
Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
And especially with having him dressed in those weird clothes,
Mm-hmm.
he looked even less like himself.
Yeah.
Right.
Es-
He just looked like a drunk.
Especially if he was known for like really caring about his appearance and how he looked and putting his best foot forward. Yeah.
Okay, oh, there's no way that's him.
Yeah. Who's this schlub?
He just looks like him.
Right.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. Yeah, there was a theory that it was actually his fiance's brothers that had him killed because they thought he was just trying to marry their sister for the money or whatever. But again, that
Mm.
doesn't explain why his clothes were changed.
Yeah.
And so that's why I feel like the cooping theory is the one that best fits the evidence. So.
That makes a lot of sense
Yeah.
based off of all the different elements.
Yeah, I think it was a cooping gone wrong.
Mhm.
I think they were too rough, and he died because of it.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Because with dark hair and stuff like that, I mean, if he didn't bleed, or if he did bleed and it healed, like it dried by then too. Because who's to say how long he had been in that state too?
Mhm.
Right.
Because
Yeah, because they'd taken him, the one typesetter guy, like, just took him to, like, a room at a pub just to, like, give him a place to stay and be comfortable. Maybe he had a little blood and the guy, like, cleaned it up in his
Yep.
efforts to,
Mhm.
try and help him. Or when they took him to the
Mhm.
hospital, maybe one of the nurses cleaned it. They just thought, "Oh, he was
Yep.
Yeah.
drunk, he passed out."
Yeah. He hit his
Hit
head
his
when he
head.
fell, which if you thought he was drunk, of course you would think that. Of course you would assume that.
Right.
Mhm.
You wouldn't think
Yeah.
that someone had intentionally hit him in the head or anything.
Yeah. But again, that whole thing with the clothes, like, to me, like,
Mhm.
that's the one piece of evidence.
And again,
Yeah.
that matches your theory, because if they would
Right.
change their clothes so they didn't look the same when they took him from station to station for voting, that makes total sense.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Right.
And now I don't wanna take credit for that. I'm not the first person to come up with that theory, so don't give me any credit on that one. I've read a lot of other people's theories, and that's the
Sure.
one I tend to agree with.
Yeah.
That does
Yeah, it makes
make
the
a
most
lot of
sense.
sense. Yep. I still want it to be Mercury just because that's what I threw out there, but it doesn't make sense
It
given all
could
the other
be.
components.
Yeah, I mean, it could be. The thing that was rattling around in his skull could literally have just been like a stone or something, that got
Mhm.
after he was decomposed or whatever. Like,
The rattling could have been fillings that would have
mhm,
fallen out as he decomposed as well, because
Mhm.
they did use like hardcore metals.
Mhm.
So if he had any dental work,
Yeah, that's
could have
true.
been rattling around.
yeah. I don't know if he did, but it could
Yeah,
be.
that's not something that, unless it was super obvious, that we would have necessarily kept tabs on around someone from
Yeah.
that time. Oh, where are
Yeah.
his
Edgar
dental
Allan Poe, his
records?
gold teeth.
Well, thank you for telling us. Like, I
Yeah.
was not familiar with his death at all. Like,
I had no idea.
I'm familiar with his works, but I guess I never
Mhm.
really thought to research him as a person, like his history and stuff. So this is like
Mhm.
fascinating.
How
Yeah.
old was he?
Oh my gosh, he was.
Because he
You're gonna
was
make me
young,
guess.
wasn't he? He wasn't even
Yeah, he
40
wasn't
yet.
that old. Yeah, he had just turned 40
He
that
had just
year. He
turned
was born
40.
January 19th,
Wow.
so he was 40.
Yeah, so not
Yikes.
that old at all.
Mm-mm.
No.
But that would have been old then.
Yeah.
It would have been old then.
Considering people died from diseases all
Well,
the
like
time.
cholera
Yeah.
and stuff during
Yeah.
that time.
Broken bones, they didn't have penicillin yet, like, literally
Nope.
anything.
Well, and
Nope.
it was a time when, yeah, it was very easy to poison yourself without really meaning to because of
Oh, yeah.
Right.
mercury and arsenic and all that fun stuff.
Would they even have been able to identify or treat brain swelling at that point?
I think
I
that they probably could have done something because, I mean,
Like drill a hole in
trepanning.
his head?
Well, I mean, if
I
it
don't
saves your
think
life,
I don't think a lot of places did that though. I think it was still
probably.
I think stuff with the brain was still kind of in its infancy. Don't quote me on that, but I feel like that's something that it still wasn't a well-known thing where they would know
Right.
what symptoms to look for. or how to even prevent that kind of thing from happening. Because I know, like, the whole, like, fevers thing, like, having them die from fevers, like, there wasn't a whole lot they did for that either.
Okay, so
Yeah.
during that time, it was considered to be a traumatic lesion.
Yeah, because I feel like the whole, what did you say they called his death? It was swelling of the brain or whatever.
Inflammation. Yeah,
Inflammation of the brain.
brain.
I feel like that was their catch-all term that they would use when someone
Yes.
passed away, and there was no real way to categorize what actually happened. I feel like that was kind of their catch-all.
Yeah.
If they weren't quite right when they passed away, but it wasn't like heart stuff or liver or anything like that. They were just kind of like, oh, it was something with the brain.
Right.
I
But
guess.
they didn't even do an autopsy on him. I mean,
Mhm.
that's the other thing that's
Right.
kind of amazing to me is they did do autopsies. That was a thing, but
Mhm.
they just didn't do one on him for whatever reason. Inflammation of the brain, like that I feel like that was a educated guess after the fact,
Mhm.
Mhm.
but it was probably right, you know?
Yep.
Yeah.
Well, and who knows, like, say this was a case of cooping, would they have known, or would they have, let me see if I can use proper English. Would they have recognized potentially some of the signs, and maybe it was a matter of they didn't want to be associated with, or they didn't want this to be getting leaked or anything if they were
Mhm.
in cahoots with whoever the politician was at the time, or
Hmm.
I don't know. I'm going to add more conspiracy theories to this mix. Why not?
Why not?
No one knows. It's fine.
Maybe the person that dropped him off was one of the people a part of that gang.
Or it got
And
out.
it was a favor. The treatment was a favor. They knew somebody in that ward.
Yeah.
Who knows?
Well,
Well, it makes sense that they wouldn't do the autopsy though, because if they didn't want to pay for the grave, they're
Yeah.
not gonna pay for an autopsy. And if they didn't have a medical school nearby that would jump at the chance for a cadaver,
Yeah.
they don't want to pay
yeah.
for it.
This is
Well, and
true.
I'm not sure how it was at specifically that time, but I think
Mhm.
it was still like illegal. Like you couldn't just donate your
Mhm.
cadaver to science. Like this
Mhm.
was the age
Right.
of the body snatchers, I'm pretty
Yeah.
sure.
With cholera too, if they didn't really know exactly how he died, they wouldn't want to mess with the body too much after
Mhm.
death as
Yeah.
well.
Yeah.
They
Yeah.
knew the cause.
But again, he had no symptoms of cholera. It
Yeah.
was all like
Mhm.
mental stuff. I think they said that he had a fever, but
Which would
I
make
mean,
sense with subdermal hematoma.
Yeah. With brain
mhm.
swelling, yeah.
Mhm.
You're going to have a fever. That's
Yeah, because your
crazy.
body's trying to fix it.
Yeah. It's crazy.
Dang.
I know. And I don't know, it's even just so much more delicious because he invented the detective story genre.
Mhm.
I mean, like, there
Right.
Yep.
was no such thing until he
Mhm.
started with Murders in the Rue Morgue with Auguste Dupin, or however you
Mhm.
say that. I'm probably absolutely mangling that name. But the fact that we needed Auguste Dupin to
Yeah,
to solve the case.
Right.
exactly. Yeah. This was before the age of, like, Agatha Christie and all that kind of stuff with her murder mysteries. And Poirot? Perot? Is that how you said? Mhm. Can't remember.
I'm an uneducated American. I can't speak
Yeah.
French.
I struggle with French.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't like I feel like when I hear Winchester Hospital, that sounds haunted to me.
Mhm.
Mm.
Do you think maybe somebody can talk to him and ask him how he died?
Yeah, seance.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Go to the
Get the
tavern.
get the spirit box out. He just
Mhm.
says Reynolds. He's still confused after death. Reynolds.
Gosh, that would
Reynolds.
be tragic, wouldn't it?
That would be
He's
so
so
tragic.
confused.
Well, thank you, DeLani, for coming on the show. I
Mhm.
really appreciate you reaching out. I'm so glad you reached out to tell us this story. It was fascinating.
Great story.
Is there anything you'd like to share with our listeners before we close out for the night? Like, plug your
Any
show?
plugs? Where can they
Sure.
find you?
They
Yeah.
can find me on YouTube at The Murder Nerd. The Murder Nerd. My next video that I'm going to be coming out with going to be something a little different. I'm going to review some of my favorite true crime books for something a little
Nice.
different.
Nice.
But
Okay.
yeah, but normally you're going to see mostly like some historical and some more current murder and crime cases is kind of
Mhm.
what my channel mostly is. So if you're into that sort of thing and you don't mind a lot of cussing, because in case you didn't, I tried to be good. I really did. But
I feel like we cuss too on here without.
Swear sometimes, so no worries if I didn't even realize if you did let some fly. I wasn't paying, we're so
I
used to
was
it that
trying.
that just kind of goes in one ear and out the other. Well, thank you again, DeLani, for coming on the show. It was an absolute pleasure meeting you and talking to you today. And on that note, as always, I'm Lindsay.
And I'm Madison.
And we'll see you next time with another tale
As old as crime.
Got something you want to say? Shoot us an email over at yeoldecrimepodcast@gmail.com. We'd love to hear your story ideas, see any gifts you send our way, or if you just want to say hello. We're pretty friendly. Speaking of friendly, if you'd like to have real-time conversations with us, consider joining our Discord over at the Cultivate Network. You can chat with us over at the Old Crimers Cubby, or catch up with any of the other great creators that are part of the Cultivate family of podcasts. Just click the link in our show notes or over on our link tree to get started today. If you're interested in ad-free content, consider supporting us with a one-time donation either over on Buy Me a Coffee or our Venmo page, both of which are in our link tree and in the show notes. If you'd like early ad-free content, not to mention some bonus material, become a member of our Patreon today for as low as $1 a month. Looking for more content? You can find us online at yeoldecrimepodcast.com. If you'd like to see pictures from this week's episode, not to mention bonus content and funny memes, make sure to follow us on Twitter at yeoldecrimepod and on Facebook and Instagram at yeoldecrimepodcast. On TikTok? Of course you are. Follow us at yeoldecrimepodcast. If you want a playlist of all our episodes on YouTube, click the link in our show notes or in our link tree and subscribe today for not only a list of our full catalog, but a separate list as well just of our Can You Crack the Cramp Word segments.